I've performed thousands of autopsies in my career, but one case still haunts me. The night I opened a body that should have been silent, only to realize it wasn't alone on the table, and neither was I. Death is supposed to be final. That's the one truth I built my career on. The certainty that once the heart stops and the blood cools, the body tells its story in silence. I had learned to read those stories in bones, in organs, in the smallest fracture or clot. Death never lies. But the case of Daniel Price proved me wrong. I still remember the way his corpse felt under the morgue lights, cold yet humming with something unnatural, like static beneath the skin. His eyes had not clouded. His scream seemed trapped in his face, as though it had followed him across the threshold of life into death. And when I cut him open, when I saw what was inside, I understood that this was not just an autopsy. This was a warning. If you choose to follow me through this account, you must know one thing: not everybody in the morgue is truly at rest. Some are waiting. The call came at 2:47 a.m. My phone buzzed violently against the nightstand, waking me from a shallow sleep. The screen glowed an unkind white, the digits stabbing at my eyes like needles in the dark. At first, I thought it was one of those automated alerts that never seemed urgent. Power outages, weather warnings, or city notifications. But then I saw the number. The morgue. No one calls a medical examiner at 3 in the morning unless something has gone very, very wrong. Dr. Hale. The voice on the other end was tight, nervous, hurried. It was the on-duty morgue attendant, a young man named Oliver who had started only 6 months ago. I could hear the tremor in his words. "Where? We've got a case. They're saying you need to come in. Right away." "Cause of death?" I asked, rubbing my temples as I swung my legs out of bed. Silence for a beat. Then, unknown, I sighed, already pulling on yesterday's pants from the chair in the corner. A liver. Every damn thing is unknown when it first comes in. Was it a homicide? Accident? What are the police saying? They're not saying anything, sir. Just that you'll want to see it for yourself. Something in his tone pulled me upright. Oliver wasn't the kind to dramatize. If anything, he was usually too casual, even flippant. In a place where reverence was required, for him to sound shaken meant this was more than another gunshot victim or overdose. "I'll be there in 20, I muttered. The roads were empty as I drove through the sleeping city. Street lamps threw pale cones of light across wet asphalt, and the silence between them pressed heavily on my chest. Nights like this reminded me of how alone you could feel, even in a city of millions. As I turned toward the county hospital complex, the morgue sat in its usual pool of shadow, separate from the main medical center, as if even the architects wanted distance from it. Its squat brick building bore no welcoming features, no windows except for a few narrow slits that reflected nothing but darkness. When I pushed through the side door, the air struck me immediately cold, sterile, laced with the faintest undercurrent of disinfectant and something heavier, something sweet and metallic. The smell of death clung to the walls here, no matter how much bleach or ammonia we used. Oliver was waiting just beyond the security desk. His eyes darted toward the stainless steel corridor that led into the autopsy suite. "It's in the main room," he whispered, though whispering wasn't necessary. The place was empty except for us. "What's in the main room?" I asked. "The body. That much I gathered. Care to tell me what's so urgent about this one?" His throat bobbed. "You'll see." The autopsy room was lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs, each humming faintly above steel tables lined in perfect rows. Most were empty tonight, save for the one in the center. The gurney stood alone, draped in a white sheet. At first glance, it seemed ordinary enough, a form beneath fabric, still and silent, but the air around it felt wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, as if I had walked into a room charged with static electricity. I pulled on gloves, snapping the latex into place. My ritual, my armor. Science is procedure. Procedure is control. All right, I said to Oliver, more to steady myself than anything. Let's have a look. He hesitated before reaching forward, gripping the corner of the sheet like it might bite him. With a shaky pull, he peeled it back. The face that stared up at me did not belong to a man who had simply died. He was young, mid-20s, maybe late 20s. Skin pale, almost gray, but not with the usual slackness of death. His features were twisted in a grotesque mask of terror, mouth frozen mid-scream, lips cracked, eyes wide and glassy but strangely wet. They hadn't clouded over yet. But it was the rest of him that stopped me. His chest bore deep, irregular lacerations, not neat cuts like a knife, but jagged, torn, as though something had raked through flesh and bone with claws. His clothing, what little remained, was shredded. Blood had soaked the fabric, dried into dark, rust-colored stains. Jesus, I muttered. What did this do? An animal attack. That's the thing, Oliver said. Police found him in an apartment, locked from the inside. I froze. Inside, he nodded. 3rd floor. No broken windows, no forced entry, no signs of anyone else there. My mind fought to organize the details. Ones like this didn't come from nothing. They were violent, intentional. But claws, teeth. In a sealed apartment, I stepped closer, examining the edges of the lacerations. Something was strange. The flesh wasn't torn in the way of traditional trauma. It looked burned around the edges, seared, almost cauterized. And yet there was blood loss. A lot of it. Time of death, I asked. Police estimate around midnight. Neighbors reported strange noises, screaming, banging. When they finally broke the door down, he was like this. I reached for the body's wrist, though I knew there would be no pulse. The skin was cold, clammy. Still, a faint shiver traveled up my arm the moment I touched him, as though static had jumped from his skin into mine. I withdrew quickly. All right, I said. Voice tight. Tag him. Log the details. I'll begin the post-mortem at first light. Oliver blinked. You're not going to start now? I hesitated. I wanted to. Part of me burned with curiosity. But another part, the older, more cautious part, knew better. I was tired. I was already rattled. And an autopsy like this needed a clear head. First light, I repeated firmly. He nodded, though I could see the relief in his eyes. As I turned to leave, I glanced back one last time at the body on the table. His eyes, wide and wet, seemed to glisten in the fluorescent light, like they were still watching me. That night, I did not sleep. Even in the safety of my own home, I kept seeing that face, frozen in terror. And though I told myself it was impossible, I could have sworn that when I left the morgue, the body's mouth had shifted. Just slightly. As though the scream was still trying to escape. Morning came reluctantly, dragging a gray sky over the city. Rain streaked against my windshield as I pulled into the hospital lot. The morgue squatted there as always, windowless, indifferent to the hour or weather. Yet today, it felt less like a workplace and more like a mouth waiting to swallow me. I pushed through the doors, the smell of disinfectant and cold air pressing around me. Oliver was already there, looking like he hadn't slept either. His eyes were rimmed red, his hands trembling as he clutched a clipboard. Morning, I muttered. He only nodded. His usual nervous chatter was absent, and I found myself missing it. The body still lay in the center of the room, draped in the white sheet. Nothing had moved overnight, yet the air felt charged, as though the room itself remembered what it was holding. I walked closer, snapping on a fresh pair of gloves. This time, there would be no hesitation. Procedure. Focus on procedure. As I pulled the sheet back, the face returned. Eyes wide, mouth contorted, a scream frozen in flesh. I forced myself not to look too long. The chest wounds were my first concern. Up close, the damage was stranger than I'd realized in the dim fluorescent light of the night before. The edges of the lacerations weren't just torn, they were charred, blackened, almost like burns, but too irregular, too raw. I leaned closer, no suit, No ash, no sign of external fire. The tissue itself looked cauterized, as though the source of heat had been inside him, searing outward. "What the hell happened to you?" I whispered. Oliver, hovering nervously near the door, shifted on his feet. "Detective Miller's here. He wants to speak with you before you start." I straightened, tugging off my gloves. "Send him in." Detective Charles Miller had been in homicide longer than I'd been in medicine. He carried himself like a man who'd seen every kind of death the city could throw at him. But even he looked unsettled this morning. His usually neat tie was crooked, his gray hair damp from the rain. "Doc," he greeted, voice gravelly. He didn't shake my hand. Never did. Some cops hated the morgue. They'd rather face a living murderer than a cold corpse. "What have you got for me?" I asked. "That's what I was hoping you could tell me." He handed over a thin file, barely a page or two of preliminary notes. Name's Daniel Price, 26, lived alone in a one-bedroom in West Halton. No priors, no known enemies. I worked at a tech startup. I flipped through the file. The words blurred, my mind still circling the wounds. "Cause of death?" "Unknown," he sighed. "Neighbors reported screaming around midnight. Said it sounded like he was fighting with someone. By the time uniforms forced the door, he was already gone. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle beyond the body itself. Nothing in the apartment was broken, nothing stolen. Doors and windows locked from the inside. And the wounds. That's the part that doesn't make sense. The meme on the scene said it looked like... Hell, I don't know. Like he'd been mauled." "Be what?" Miller rubbed his jaw. "That's the thing. There were no animals in that apartment, and the door had been locked with a deadbolt from the inside. No footprints, no prints at all, except his." I closed the file, looking back at the body. If someone else was there, they didn't come in or leave the usual way. "Exactly." Miller's eyes hardened, which leaves me with two possibilities. Either someone found a way that I don't understand, or this man. He hesitated. "Did it to himself." I frowned. "These wounds aren't self-inflicted, not unless he had claws the size of carving knives. And even then, the burn pattern. No, absolutely not." Miller gave a dry chuckle, but it carried no humor. "Didn't think so. Still, you're the expert. You tell me what you find, and maybe I can make sense of it." He left without another word, leaving the morgue feeling colder than before. I began the autopsy at 9:12 a.m. The recorder clicked on, my voice steady as I spoke the required lines. "This is Dr. Adrian Hale conducting a post-mortem examination on Daniel Price, age 26. Body identified by fingerprints, case number 2314. Procedure, control, science." I made the initial Y incision, scalpel slicing cleanly from each shoulder down to the sternum, and then in a single line down the abdomen. The skin parted easily, though the burned edges of the chest wounds made the process slower, tougher. Oliver hovered, pale as milk, his eyes darting anywhere but the body. "Stay with me," I instructed. Scalpel, retractors. We peeled back the chest plate, exposing the organs. And for the first time in my career, I froze. The organs weren't where they should have been. The heart sat slightly higher than normal, angled almost diagonally, as though it had shifted in panic. The lungs were deflated, collapsed inward, but strangely blackened, as if smoke had filled them from the inside. But it was the heart that drew me. Its surface was blistered, charred. The muscle looked cooked. I touched it gently with the probe. The tissue was brittle, fragile, breaking apart like burned paper. "Jesus," Oliver muttered, gagging. "It's like somebody microwaved him." I didn't answer. My mind was racing. Burns like this didn't come from within a body. They came from external fire, electrical current, something tangible. But there were no burns on the skin beyond the lacerations. It was as if his heart had ignited. I forced myself onward, cataloging each abnormality. Liver intact, though oddly pale. Stomach, Contents partially digested, no sign of toxins at first glance. Intestines unremarkable. When I reached the brain, though, everything stopped again. The cranium opened with the usual precision, saw buzzing through bone. When the skull cap lifted, I expected the familiar gray folds. But the tissue beneath was wrong. The brain pulsed. Not literally, not with a heartbeat. But the surface glistened, contracting faintly like something alive. The tissue shimmered with a faint sheen, wet and too vibrant. I stared, hands frozen in midair. Brains do not move after death. They collapse. They soften. They do not pulse. "Dr. Hale?" Oliver's voice was trembling. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Record this," I said quietly. "Unusual post-mortem brain activity. Tissue appears animated." Animated, a clinical word for something that should never be. The recorder hummed softly as silence fell over the room. And in that silence, I could have sworn I heard something else. A whisper. Faint. Indistinct, like breath against the ear. I froze, glancing at Oliver, but his face was pale, his eyes wide. He hadn't spoken. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He shook his head quickly. "No, sir. I didn't hear anything. But I had. And it had come from the open skull on the table. I forced myself to finish the exam, every movement mechanical. Notes were dictated, organs weighed, samples taken. But my mind wasn't in it. When at last the body was stitched closed and the tools sterilized, I sank into the chair at my desk, staring at the blank report page. Cause of death unknown. Manner of death undetermined. But those words felt like lies. What I had seen wasn't just unknown. It was impossible. And yet the body of Daniel Price lay cold and silent in the morgue, hiding its secrets beneath sutures. I leaned back, closing my eyes. That whisper still clung to my ears, like the dead man had tried to speak. The morgue was never silent, not truly. There was always the low hum of fluorescent lights, the faint mechanical whir of refrigeration units, the occasional creak of metal settling into its foundations. But that afternoon, after we closed Daniel Price's chest, it felt like even those familiar sounds had faded, leaving behind a hollow stillness. I should have walked away, filed the preliminary report, waited for lab results, let the evidence speak later. That's what protocol demands. But something gnawed at me, a relentless itch in the back of my skull. That brain, that impossible shimmer, the whisper. I told myself I'd only take one more look. Just one. Science requires certainty after all. If I didn't confirm what I thought I'd seen, it would haunt me worse. "Oliver," I said. He looked up from sanitizing instruments, his hands still trembling, prepped the cranial cavity again. His eyes widened. "Sir, we already... again." I interrupted, my voice sharper than intended. "We missed something." He hesitated, then obeyed, rolling the gurney back under the surgical lamps. The sutures I'd so carefully stitched were cut away. The skull cap lifted once more. And there it was. The brain, glistening in the harsh light, faintly undulating as if it were breathing. Oliver gagged softly. That's not possible." "No," I agreed, though my voice was thin. "It isn't." I leaned closer, scalpel poised. "But we're going to find out." The first incision should have been routine, a simple slice across the frontal lobe for sampling. But the moment the blade touched the tissue, every light in the morgue flickered. The hum of the fluorescence cut out, plunging the room into a half-second of suffocating dark before sputtering back on. Oliver cursed, stepping back. "Did you see that?" "Faulty wiring?" I said quickly, though my own pulse had jumped. "Keep steady." I sliced again. The tissue parted, but instead of the expected dull resistance of dead flesh, there was a faint twitch, a ripple across the folds of gray matter. And then, God help me, fluid seeped from the cut. Not blood, not cerebrospinal fluid. Something thicker, darker. It shimmered under the light like oil, slick and black with an iridescent sheen. The smell hit us next. Metallic, sharp, but also sweet, like rotting fruit left too long in the sun. Oliver gagged, stumbling back. Oh, Jesus, what is that? I forced my hands to remain steady, though every instinct screamed to drop the scalpel. Sample jar, I demanded. He fumbled one forward, glass rattling against his gloves. I collected the substance carefully, sealing the lid tight. My hands shook, not from clumsiness, but from something deeper, fear. Brains do not bleed oil. As I worked, the morgue itself seemed to change. The temperature dropped sharply, condensation forming on the lamps above us. My breath fogged in the air, mingling with Oliver's ragged gasps. "Something's wrong with the air conditioning," he muttered. But I knew better. This wasn't air conditioning. This was something else. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched too far, reaching like fingers. The hum of the refrigeration units faltered, dropping into silence. The only sound left was the faint drip of that black fluid into the jar. And then, a new sound. Whispering, soft, indistinct, like a voice just beyond comprehension, threading through the air itself. I froze, scalpel hovering above the brain. "Oliver," I whispered. "Tell me if you hear that." His face was chalk white. I think so." The whispers grew louder, though never clear, as though spoken underwater. My ears strained for meaning, desperate for something to latch onto. And then, just for an instant, I understood. It said my name, Adrian. I dropped the scalpel. It clattered against the steel table, echoing far too loudly in the oppressive silence. Oliver stumbled back, nearly tripping over his stool. What the hell was that? Who said that? I stared at the brain, its surface glistening, twitching faintly. The whisper was gone now, leaving only the distant hum of the lights. "It came from the body," I said before I could stop myself. Oliver's eyes widened. No, that's not possible." But I knew it was. I had heard it. The dead man had spoken. I forced myself to resume, though my hands shook so violently the scalpel nearly slipped. Procedure keeps the fear away. I took more samples. Tissue slides. Fluid extractions. Each time, the lights flickered, the air thickened, the whispers stirred. And with each whisper, I felt it more clearly. It wasn't just sound. It was a thought. A presence pressing against my skull, brushing my mind with cold fingers. By the time I set the last sample aside, my gloves were slick with oil, like residue, my body trembling with exhaustion and dread. "That's enough," I said hoarsely. "Shield him up. We'll analyze these later." Oliver didn't argue. His hands moved too quickly, too eager to cover the thing that lay on the table. But before we could finish, the corpse moved. Not a spasm, not a post-mortem twitch. Something deliberate. The chest rose. A shudder of air rattled through the lungs, wheezing past seared tissue. For one horrifying second, Daniel Price's body drew breath. Oliver screamed, stumbling backward so hard he crashed against a cabinet. Instruments rattled to the floor around him. I stood frozen, scalpel still in hand, watching as the corpse's chest rose and fell once more. A second breath, then a third. The eyes, stitched closed, twitched beneath the sutures. And then, impossibly, they opened. Clouded but glistening, they rolled upward to meet mine. The whisper returned, louder now, pressing directly into my skull. "You shouldn't have cut." I staggered back, heart slamming against my ribs. My scalpel slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor. The corpse's mouth opened, stitches tearing as black fluid bubbled between its lips. Oliver bolted for the door, slamming into it with frantic fists, screaming for help. But I couldn't move. I was locked in place, staring as the dead man's mouth stretched wider, the whisper deepening into something like a growl. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The chest deflated, the mouth closed, the eyes rolled lifeless once more. Silence reclaimed the morgue. Only the echo of Oliver's panicked sobs and my own ragged breathing remained. We stitched him back together with shaking hands, neither of us speaking. No one would believe what we'd seen. Hell, I barely believed it myself. But I knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary autopsy, and Daniel Price was not finished with us yet. By the time we finished resealing Daniel Price's body, both Oliver and I were drenched in sweat despite the morgue's refrigerator chill. Neither of us spoke as we cleaned the instruments. Words seemed dangerous, like naming what we had just seen would make it real. But silence was no safer. It left room for the memory of that whisper, the sound of my name curling through my skull in a voice that was not a voice. Oliver finally broke. I'm not staying here tonight," he stammered, his hands trembling so badly he nearly dropped a tray of scalpels. "You can write me up, I don't care." "I'm not staying with that thing in here." I didn't argue. Part of me wanted to tell him he was being unprofessional, cowardly even. But I couldn't. Not after what I had seen. "Go," I said quietly. "I'll finish the report." He looked at me like I was insane. "You're staying. I don't have a choice." He swallowed hard, nodded once, and fled. The door slammed shut behind him, the echo carrying too long through the empty halls. And then it was just me and the body. The morgue grew impossibly quiet once Oliver's footsteps faded. The hum of the lights seemed muted, the air heavy, pressing. My every breath sounded too loud. I told myself I would do what I always did: follow procedure, break the impossible into pieces until it becomes manageable. Science was not about certainty, it was about persistence. Even the unexplainable had patterns. I reopened the case file, my pen hovering. Subject exhibits unusual tissue responses. Possible contamination, unidentified fluid, sample pending analysis. The words looked clinical on paper, neat, contained, but they were lies. I stood, staring once more at the stitched body on the table. Rationality demanded I walk away. Go home, sleep. But something hooked me, pulling me back. I needed to look deeper. The abdomen came first. I reopened the sutures carefully, exposing the organs once again. They lay quiet under the harsh fluorescent glare, slick and glistening, but wrong. The stomach, for instance, wasn't where it should be. It sat higher, tucked unnaturally close to the diaphragm. When I touched it, the muscle twitched faintly. I froze, my probe hovering. Reflex twitch. No, this was too precise, too deliberate. I made an incision, collecting a sample of the contents. Half-digested food, unremarkable, except for something else. At first, I thought it was bone. A shard, pale against the slurry of stomach acid. But when I lifted it with forceps, I realized it wasn't bone at all. It was a tooth, humans. Molars, by their shape. I stared at it, bile rising in my throat. "Oh, God," I whispered. The implications were sickening. Cannibalism. Ritual. But the enamel was blackened, cracked, as though exposed to immense heat. I dropped it into a specimen jar, the glass clinking far too loudly. Next came the lungs. Their tissue was almost unrecognizable, blackened, seared like charcoal. But when I touched them with the probe, they gave way with a faint crackle, releasing a puff of soot. I jerked back, coughing. The soot hung in the air, glittering faintly as it caught the light. And with it came that sound again. Whispering faint, curling through the morgue like smoke. This time it wasn't my name. The words were fragmented, indistinct, but they carried weight, a language that brushed the edge of recognition without clarity, like something ancient. I gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "Stop it," I hissed. The whispering ceased. The morgue fell silent once more. The heart came next. I had seen it before, charred, brittle, as though it had burned from the inside out. But now, under closer inspection, I realized it wasn't just damaged, it was hollow. A cavity ran through the left ventricle, the tissue eaten away as though something had burrowed inside. No medical condition explained this. No disease. No injury. I slid the probe inside, tracing the cavity. It extended deeper than it should have, winding, twisting, almost like a tunnel. And then the probe snagged on something. I pulled it free, dragging out a fragment. Not tissue. Not bone. It was metal. A sliver of something dark, etched with faint, intricate markings. Too deliberate to be random. Symbols. I held it under the lamp, heart pounding. The carvings weren't letters I recognized, not Latin, not Greek, not anything I had seen in pathology journals. But they seemed to shift as I stared, rearranging themselves, curling into new forms. I dropped it into a jar, sealed the lid tight. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. The brain was last. I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone. But the memory of that whisper, that impossible shimmer, left me no choice. The skull cap came off again, exposing the glistening tissue. It pulsed faintly, as though alive. This time, I prepared a slide, pressing a thin section beneath the glass, lowering it carefully under the microscope. I adjusted the focus, the tissue swimming into view. And then my stomach turned. The cells weren't normal. They weren't even human. Instead of the familiar neurons, the slide revealed structures that looked almost crystalline, jagged and sharp. They pulsed faintly, sending ripples across the slide, as though aware of being observed. And in that moment, a thought entered my mind, not my own. "We see you." I stumbled back from the microscope, nearly knocking it from the counter. My breath came hard and fast, sweat stinging my eyes. The morgue lights flickered again. The shadows stretched, deepening, curling toward the table like living things. I wasn't alone. I knew it then, with certainty sharper than any scalpel. Something was inside Daniel Price. Something that had not died. I staggered to the sink, splashing water on my face, trying to steady myself. My reflection stared back, pale, hollow-eyed. I barely recognized myself. Behind me, the morgue was silent once more. Too silent. And then, from the table, came a sound. Not breath, not whisper. Laughter, faint, broken, like glass grinding against glass. I spun, heart slamming. The corpse lay still, eyes stitched, mouth shut. But I had heard it. And God help me, I knew it wasn't the last time. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself I would, that I'd go home, pour a drink, collapse on the couch. But I stayed. Something inside me refused to leave that morgue, refused to let the body of Daniel Price rest without answers. Every creak in the walls, every flicker of the lights set me on edge. My nerves were raw, but I forced myself to keep working, documenting, writing. Science had always been my shield. If I could record it, I could contain it. By 3 a.m., exhaustion made my vision blur. I set the pen down, rubbed my eyes. When a knock at the morgue door startled me so badly the clipboard clattered to the floor. I froze. No one should have been here, not at that hour. The knock came again, steady, firm. I approached the door, every instinct screaming not to open it. But the procedure demanded it. Visitors, even in the dead of night, had to be logged. Through the small glass window, I saw him. Detective Miller. He looked even more ragged than when I first saw him in the ER. His tie was loose, his hair unkempt, his eyes bloodshot. "Ale," he rasped as soon as I opened the door. "Why need to talk?" I stepped aside, letting him in. "What are you doing here at this hour?" He ignored the question, pacing the length of the morgue. His hands trembled. "I pulled the tapes," he said finally. "Tapes? From the ER? From when they brought him in?" "Price." He dragged a hand down his face. "You need to see this." He produced a USB drive, slamming it onto the counter. I wasn't supposed to take this, but after what I saw, after what I heard, I inserted it into the workstation, the screen humming to life. The footage was grainy, standard hospital security quality. The ER bay, nurses rushing, doctors leaning over Daniel Price's body. Nothing unusual. First, then, the monitors spiked, just like I remembered. Price's body convulsed. But in the recording, there was more. The room itself seemed to distort, the fluorescent lights stretching, bending. For a brief instant, the shadows along the walls moved independently, writhing like smoke. And then, frames missing, skip. When the footage returned, Price was still. Dead. I leaned closer, heart pounding. "Wet! Go back!" Miller rewound. We froze the frame just as the shadows wreathed. At the far edge of the screen, near the doorway, stood a figure. Too tall, too thin, its face blurred, indistinct, as though the camera refused to capture it, but its head was turned, directly at the lens, directly at us. I recoiled. Jesus Christ. Miller's jaw tightened. You see it too, then? I thought I was going mad. We let the footage play. After Price flatlined, the figure was gone. The shadows receded. The room returned to normal. But the impression lingered, an aftertaste of dread, impossible to shake. Miller shut the laptop with a snap. I've been on the force 20 years. Seen things no one should, but this. He broke off, shaking his head. It's not just a case anymore, Hale. It's something else. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice steady. What are you saying? I'm saying, he whispered, leaning close, that whatever's inside Price, it wasn't alone. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The morgue seemed to grow colder, the fluorescent lights dimming as though straining. I found myself staring at Price's body again. The stitched skin, the jarred samples are waiting for analysis. The symbols etched into that fragment of metal, all the unanswered questions. Miller finally straightened, his voice firm. I'm going to keep digging. There's more to this. Records, reports, hell, maybe even cover-ups. If I find anything, I'll bring it here. You think this goes deeper? He gave a humorless laugh. I think we're already drowning. With that, he pocketed the USB and left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until silence swallowed them whole. I was alone again, but not really. Because as I turned back to the morgue table, I saw it. The faintest shift in Daniel Price's stitched mouth. Like a smile. The body of Daniel Price should never have been alive. It should never have twitched, whispered, or laughed. But science offered no answers, only deeper mysteries. Teeth in the stomach, soot in the lungs, symbols inside the heart, and crystalline neurons that whispered back. And worse, the security footage proved the impossible wasn't confined to one man's corpse. Something else had been watching. Waiting. Present in the hospital the night Price died. Now I know the truth. The morgue is no longer a place of silence. It's a place of listening. And something in the dark is listening back.
Subscribe for more videos.